$12.50, what's going to happen to your expected present discounted value of your lifetime earnings if you don't get that same halo effect from graduating from the most selective school that admits you. It's a complicated thing because you're likely to have a higher GPA at the other school. It's this sort of, the literature is called the big fish in a small pond literature. So part of losing the halo effect from graduating, so you get into Penn, I hope that happens, but instead you take merit aid and you go to some other school with an average not 1450 but 1250. If your GPA goes up from a 3.3 to a 3.9, that pretty much makes up for the 200 points of loss in the halo effect. So that's relevant, but it also is relevant to understand that exactly the return to greater selectivity depends critically on gender, race, and income background. There was a very famous paper called the Penn State paper by Alan Kruger, great labor economist at Princeton. He was the chairman until recently of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. A lot of people misunderstand that paper. So if you just Google, should you go to the most selective school that admits you, you're immediately going to see that Alan Kruger, who is a much better economist than I am, says no. If you actually read the paper, you'll see that it's more nuanced than that. First of all, that was a sample of 27 different schools, the least selective of which was Penn State. And Penn State is a great school. So Penn State is not to be confused with an open enrollment. Some people say, oh, but doesn't the literature say you can go to a community college versus four-year, open admission versus highly, no. The Kruger Penn versus Penn State showed, and that paper did demonstrate, it's a great paper, I tried to disprove it, he was right, that for a white man from a relatively affluent background, it doesn't matter if you go to Penn State or to University of Pennsylvania. Now, the reason why is because you're going to pay sticker price at University of Pennsylvania, plus, even with room and board, it's going to be a third as much at Penn State. So that's one thing, is that you're paying more, and the differential earnings over your lifetime only make up in present discounted value the differential net tuition, okay? The second thing, though, is to realize, as I said before, that Penn State is one of the best schools in America. There are only 60 research universities in America that are members of the Association of American Universities. One of them is Penn State. So it's like, do you go to Penn or Penn State? Like Penn State is like some two-year safety school or something. It's not. It's a great school. So that's what the paper really did is you go to a public flagship, equivalent to Urbana-Champaign, or do you go to University of Chicago or Northwestern? It's not whether you go to UIC. It's not whether you go to Roosevelt or Columbia or DePaul or Loyola. All very good schools, but much less selective than Penn State. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is a paper that I did, but now Alan's done a version of it as well. I did it actually 20 years ago. It's a long time, but it's now been updated. Where you go to school, the return to selectivity varies a lot by race and by gender. So it's true, as Alan found, that for most affluent white men, to go to a good school versus a great school is not going to affect the future of their earning stream. But for a woman, it does, and for non-white, it really does. And in fact, I did a paper that looked at, this was based on data, we didn't have enough Asian Americans, we didn't have enough Latinos. So all this was white men, white women, African American women, and African American men. And we did basically what Alan ended up doing 10 years later and got very famous for. We actually did a rate of return ongoing to the most selective school that admitted you. And just as he had found later, for white men, particularly white men who don't need financial aid, it doesn't really matter where you go, as long as it's a good school. And if they give you merit aid, you might as well go to a good school and save some money on a great school. A white woman, the differential in the earning stream was enough to justify the differential in tuition, not getting merit aid and paying a higher net cost, including room and board. For an African American woman, it mattered a lot. For an African American man to go to the most selective school versus the least selective school in our sample doubled lifetime earnings. It raises, this is the last thing I'd say, it raises a real interesting question about what happens at higher education. What is it? Is it, you're learning social skills? Is it you're learning, how to write and do critical thinking? Is it that you have a kind of a socialization going on, or is it just getting a credential, like I said before, the halo effect from graduating from a good school? The interesting question is, what's the difference between white men and African American men, between Penn and Penn State? Is it that, white men don't learn any more at Penn versus Penn State, but black men learn twice as much? And the answer is probably no. It's in a labor force that's very skeptical, and that frankly, one of my co-authors, David Figlio, did a wonderful paper on inherent racism in the labor force, particularly at starting positions. It's more important in this paper for black men to go to a really name brand, very famous Ivy or school like Northwestern, as opposed to a white guy who is favored in the labor market all along, right? And sometimes has connections and sometimes has other ways to get interviews at, investment banks and consulting, et cetera. So I think actually the best evidence that what we do to a substantial part is to credential people as opposed to teach them is this paper on differential returns to quality for black men versus white men.